Perhaps the most historic journey made by 3801 was the crossing of the continent in 1970. The first loco to run all the way from the east coast of Australia to the west coast. We have the story of that unique journey, which marked the 200th anniversary of the discovery of the east coast of Australia by Captain James Cook. Cook's ship was called the Endeavour, and the train hauled by 3801 was called the Western Endeavour. It was one of the really great train journeys in the history of steam.
The trip of the Western Endeavour was to be the journey of a lifetime. By steam train across the Australian continent. A round trip of almost 5,000 miles or 8,000 kilometres. One of the greatest steam train journeys in history and the culmination of 6 years of planning by the New South Wales Rail Transport Museum. The city of Sydney on the east coast was the departure point for the epic journey, which began on Saturday, August the 22nd, 1970. Sydney-siders watched with fascination as the first train to steam from the Pacific Ocean to the Indian Ocean set out. The Blue Mountains of the Great Dividing Range, with grades as steep as 1 in 33, was the first challenge for the two 38-class locomotives hauling the Western Endeavour. Australia is the world's flattest continent. The greater challenges were of distance and logistics. For one of the passengers, Harold Young, this was a proud moment. As Chief Mechanical Engineer of the New South Wales Railways in the 1940s, Harold Young was in charge of the design of the 38 class.
It's great satisfaction to see the locomotive that you had in your mind working. It's you, really. And any carelessness or any mismanagement hurts. It does, you know. I've always had an ambition as a designing engineer that I'd like to have the freedom to provide a locomotive entirely new from the rail to the chimney. It's a living thing, and it always amazed me that it could go on its own. It would run. I'm a great admirer of the racehorse, and I thought if I could put 2,000 racehorses together, horsepower, it would make a very good locomotive. There it is.
Once over the mountains, the train was steaming into the vast expanse of the Australian outback. The coast-to-coast passengers settled down to savour with exclusive pleasure the special joys of 3 weeks of steam travel. In the loco cabs, the hard work of keeping up steam pressure had its own special pleasure for the crews. This was no ordinary job. This was history in the making, a step back in time to the great days when steam was king. Locomotive 3801, arguably the most famous locomotive in Australia, was to travel to Perth in Western Australia. 3813 would assist in the haul at times as far as Port Augusta in South Australia. Menindee, the Darling River crossing. Never before had a 38 been seen this far west. For the people of the outback settlement, the spectacle was a great attraction. The journey so far had tarnished the engines, so some of the paying passengers went to work cleaning them up. Many of the local children were seeing a steam locomotive for the first time, and it was a memorable experience. Ensuring adequate water and coal supplies on vast stretches of track that hadn't seen a steam engine for many years was a major planning task for the organisers. But for the Western Endeavour, nothing had been left to chance. The idea of taking 3801 across the continent originated with the New South Wales Rail Transport Museum. The project was eventually backed by the state railways of New South Wales, South Australia, Western Australia, and the Commonwealth Railways. On the run across the plains, the 38s worked in relays on the train because the civil engineers had not planned on the line supporting two heavy 38s. Broken Hill was an overnight stop and an opportunity for the locomotives to be given a thorough inspection. But as at other inspection points on the journey, they needed little attention. A second tank with 7,000 gallons of water was attached. Early next day, the train, manned by South Australian Railways crews and accompanied by enthusiasts in cars, set out on the new standard gauge line to Port Pirie. Alongside was the abandoned narrow gauge line. The train was on one of the two standard gauge links that were built in the 1960s to provide Australia with its one gauge railway line connecting Brisbane to Perth. Peterborough was once a major narrow-gauge steam locomotive depot and important rail junction. When the Western Endeavour passed through, the demise of steam was evident. Stored on side tracks, cold and silent, were the 400 class Garretts, some of the 28 steam engines waiting the scrapper's torch. At Port Pirie, an air-conditioned dining car was added to the train, and crewmen from the Commonwealth Railways took over. The passengers appreciated the improved dining facilities, but up on the footplate, firemen used to diesels were wielding the shovel for the first time in their careers. At selected locations, special photographic run-bys were staged. 3813 stayed at Port Augusta, while 3801 steamed west. A 3,000 horsepower diesel CL3 was attached to save water on the long desert run. In any case, the Commonwealth Railways could not find enough qualified steam drivers for two 38s. Ahead, more than 1,000 miles, 1,600 kilometers, across barren country almost devoid of people. A land of salt lakes, salt bush and desert. Not another town for hundreds of miles. The diesel was sent well ahead for the now memorable photo run-bys. The train carried a van full of bagged coal, a van of spare parts, and a workshop. A fitter or mechanic travelled all the way to put things back together if repairs were necessary. Dusty railway settlement and a short stop to cross an eastbound freight. After passing the halfway point of the journey, 3801 pulled into Tarcoola. It was not much more than a whistle stop with a pub, but years ago, in the days of steam, it was a locomotive servicing depot. The return of steam was a big event. Every servicing detail enthralled spectators, and all of the children received a souvenir lump of coal. Nullarbor sunrise. During the night, the train had entered the featureless expanse of the limestone plain. Eons ago, the bed of the sea. Rusted relics of the steam age. Cook, in the days of steam, was the main engine servicing depot on the transcontinental line. For this trip, top-grade fuel had been railed well in advance across the country from the coalfields north of Sydney. Cook is home to the men who run the trains and maintain the line, and home to their families. just a speck on the massive emptiness of the treeless Nullarbor plain. While the train was at Cook, the last of the motoring steam enthusiasts turned up. They'd become bogged in sand the previous evening, but, unbelievably, found a bulldozer in the middle of nowhere with the key in the ignition. They used it to haul their car clear of the sand. The journey continued on the longest section of straight track in the world, 297 miles, that's 478 kilometers without a bend. All day, early morning to early evening, without a curve. The border with Western Australia, a landmark, and an event worth recording. The first time a New South Wales locomotive had crossed this border. In this country, there's not too much in line-side features. With the desert behind it, the Western Endeavour had an overnight stop at Rawlinna. In the morning, washed and serviced, 3801 headed towards Kalgoorlie. Early morning crossing the luxurious eastbound Indian Pacific. At Parkston, outside Kalgoorlie, the Commonwealth Railway's diesel was detached, so 3801 could take the train solo to the end of its journey. The gold mining city of Kalgoorlie, which has one of the longest station platforms in Australia, the Big 38 got a big welcome. the locals enjoyed the train, many passengers toured the district. Next day, before the final run into Perth, the crew and passengers gave 3801 a good clean and polish at Meriden. It was an exhilarating run through glorious countryside and the Avon Valley. For the 139 passengers, it was a satisfying experience. The Western Endeavour was near its goal, the west coast of Australia. Through the suburbs of Perth, 7 days after leaving Sydney, 3801 was steaming into history in grand style. Perth Terminal, thousands of people welcomed the train, its crew and passengers. It was a triumphant arrival, a triumph for steam. There were bands and speeches to welcome 3801 to Perth. But for those who had so many years earlier dreamed of making such a trip, there was a more eloquent, more satisfying sound. The sound of 3801, alive and at rest, after crossing the continent.
You expect it. Well, that's what it should do. You feel it's competent to do it. It's right. It did 12,000 miles a month without any trouble at all. And it's only 5,000 there and back.